In this video, we're going to peek behind the curtain and look briefly at the .NET Framework, what it is and how it works and supports your applications. We're also going to talk about namespaces, and we'll look at several of the top .NET Framework class libraries namespaces that you can use within your application to extend its functionality. And then finally, we're going to look at how to navigate through the help system to find more information about classes in the .NET Framework class library. Okay, so what is the .NET Framework? Well, it's difficult to describe, so we're going to stay at a fairly high level in this video. So as a result, this video is probably going to be a lot shorter than the previous ones. Now, if you're really interested about the internals of how the .NET Framework works, what it does for you behind the scenes, there are several really good books that are available that go into a lot of depth on the .NET Framework. And a book is probably the more appropriate format for that type of material because it is more theoretical and less visual. So I would refer you to those. Both of these books are available from the Microsoft Press. They're titled Applied Microsoft .NET Framework Programming, and there's a version for C#, and then there's also a version for Visual Basic .NET. So make sure you get the version that you're most interested in. And I will warn you that this is fairly in-depth information, so it will definitely take you from a beginner to an advanced developer very quickly, but it might be a little confusing in the process. So just fair warning there. But that resource is available to you. Also, I provided a document that accompanies the videos that has some additional information about the .NET Framework and so on. Again, we're going to stay at a fairly high level, so let's talk about the different parts of the .NET Framework. As I've just alluded to, the .NET Framework is actually several things. First of all, you have the Framework Class Library, referred to as the FCL. Secondly, you have the .NET Runtime Host. And then third, there are a bunch of utilities and things that we'll talk about in just a moment. First of all, let's talk about the Framework Class Library, or the FCL. This is actually a series of classes that have methods that encapsulate common system or application-related functionality. Almost everything that's interesting that you'll ever want to do within your applications will require that you use the classes that are supplied within the FCL. Now, we've used the message box, for example. That's in the Framework Class Library. We've used the different controls from the toolbox. That's all contained within the Framework Class Library. If we want to access a database, or if we want to open up an XML file, as we'll do in the next couple of videos, those both require the use of the .NET Framework Class Library. Think of the Framework Class Library as a bunch of classes that are available to your application that you didn't have to write, but you get for free just by virtue of the fact that you're writing a Visual Basic application. There are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of classes, and there's probably no chance that you're going to learn about every single class. But you're going to be able to find out the ones that are most popular, the ones that help you accomplish what you're trying to do most of the time by usually either looking at code examples or reading books, or by using the help system, as I'll show you how to do later on in this video. The next part of the .NET Framework is the .NET Runtime Host. And you can think of this as sort of like a protective bubble that keeps your application and your computer safe. Now, that's really an oversimplification. It does a lot more stuff than that. But, for example, it manages permissions for your application, and these permissions are granted to applications to run on your computer based on where the code originated from, whether the code originated from the local desktop machine, or whether it was run from the internet or run from a corporate intranet. And so in that way, you can prevent certain applications from being executed automatically as you surf to a given website. Those applications may not be given the permission to access your hard drive, for example, but might be able to display a form on the screen. So there's different levels and permissions that are given based on where the code came from, whether or not the code has been signed with a digital certificate, and things of that nature. Also, the .NET Runtime Host provides a common type system across all .NET languages. So you could write a VB.NET application that can reference code that's written in a C# application and so on. And that's fairly unique. That's not something that just comes automatically with any programming language. It took a lot of forethought and a lot of effort to make that happen. And then also the .NET Runtime host makes sure that no memory is leaked. In other words, no memory is left over once your application has terminated, or as your application finishes using references to variables and references to objects, it will clean up the memory, and so you don't have to worry about it. And then third, you have a set of utilities that come with the .NET Framework. And these utilities include compilers, debugging tools, tools that automatically produce certain types of code or XML, and really there's so many different utilities it's difficult to put them into one container or another. Most of these tasks that you perform using these utilities are not something that you really need to worry about for the moment, since you're just getting started. So we're not going to cover them in any detail at all in this series of lessons. However, if you open up Windows Explorer and you navigate to Windows/Microsoft.net/framework/version 2.0. whatever is the extended version on the end, you can see that if you were to sort the applications or the files by type, there's a number of different .exe applications that are available, and all of these are the types of utilities that are accessible through the .NET Framework. Okay, so now let's talk about how the .NET applications work. Whenever you create an application and you create an executable like we saw in the very first video, where we identified where the .exe file was saved in the bin directory, what actually happens behind the scenes? How does the .NET Framework Runtime, for example, support your application? So that's what we're going to talk about now. First of all, whenever you compile your application, it creates what's called an assembly. An assembly is usually a file with a .exe extension or a .dll extension. And the code that's contained within this file is called intermediate language, or rather IL. It's a temporary language that will be compiled a second time whenever your application is installed on its target computer. So for example, if you were to create a .exe application and give it to a friend, and they're running Windows 98, it's going to then, the first time the application is run, compile a special version of your application using the .exe assembly, using the intermediate language inside that assembly, that is specific to not only Windows 98, but also the specific processor and the amount of memory and things of that nature. It tweaks the application to perform optimally on that system. If you were to give the application then to a different friend, it would go through that same compilation step where it determines the operating system, the processor, and other features about that person's system, and compiles a version of the application for use on that computer. This is called just-in-time compilation, and it's a unique feature of the .NET Framework, and it's something that allows your applications to run smoothly regardless of the operating system, as long as it's Windows-based, regardless of the processor speed and things of that nature. The application will be tuned up automatically without you having to do anything about it, so that it runs as best it can on that person's computer. Now, when that person actually tries to execute the application the first time, it goes through this just-in-time compilation step. And then all subsequent times, what will happen is it will use that optimized version of the assembly in order to run from that point on. So that compilation step only happens once. When the application is running, the runtime, the .NET runtime, will host the assembly. Now, what does it mean to host the assembly? Again, that's a little bit difficult thing to explain because it does a lot of things. Some of the things that we described earlier, where it protects the computer from memory leaks, protects the computer from malicious code that might be written based on the credentials of where the application was originally launched from, and looks for security violations and things of that nature. The runtime also provides access to the framework class library so that the application can access the file system if it needs to, or access a database, and all the things that the FCL will allow the application to do. So the runtime provides access to those classes. And then, like we talked about earlier, whenever object references and variables are no longer needed, those items are removed automatically from memory by a special feature of the .NET Runtime host called the garbage collector. So it goes around and looks for things that are no longer being used, and it removes them from memory. And so you don't have to worry about cleaning up memory or anything of that nature like programmers in the past had to do. That's all taken care of for you. So you can just concentrate on creating the core functionality of your application. Now again, all of this functionality is provided for you without you having to explicitly call the runtime. When somebody tries to execute your application on their computer, the .exe file will tell the computer that it requires the .NET runtime in order to run. And if the user doesn't have the runtime, then they'll get an error message on their screen that telling them that it requires the use of the .NET runtime, and I think it even gives them the location where they can download the runtime so that they can run the application. If they've been keeping their Windows their version of Windows updated with the latest security patches, they should have the most recent version of the .NET Framework runtime. However, when you create an installation program that places your program on the user's hard drive and creates a nice little icon in their start menu, the install program that you create with Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition can also include the .NET runtime. So if a user doesn't have the particular version of the runtime that you compiled your application with, then it could be installed during the installation routine for your application. Now, if the user already has the .NET runtime on their system, then your application will just simply execute. So it's not really crucial at this point that you understand everything about the .NET runtime or really any part of the .NET framework at first since you're just getting started. But just understand that there's this whole support system that really won't allow your application to fail or even to break somebody else's computer, which is a fairly comforting thought. Now we're going to completely switch gears and begin to talk about namespaces. As a Visual Basic developer, namespaces are a little more transparent to you than, say, somebody who's currently learning about C#. However, namespaces are ever present behind the scenes without you perhaps realizing that they even exist until now. Now, we've noted in the previous lesson that fields, properties, and methods must live within the context, or rather within the code block of a class. But classes must live within the context or the code block of a namespace. Now, while this isn't readily apparent at first, if we take a look at the property pages by right-clicking on our project name within the Solution Explorer and selecting Properties, you can see that in the upper right-hand corner of the Application tab of our property pages for our current project called Lesson 07 that there's something called a root namespace, which in this case is identical to the project name. So all classes that we create in our project live within the namespace Lesson 07 in this particular instance. Now the purpose of a namespace is that it helps you write code to avoid naming conflicts. And let me explain what that means. Suppose you work at a big company. In particular, let's use the previous lesson's example of an auto manufacturer. And you work there and you create applications for the finance department within that auto manufacturer. Now another programmer at that same company, he happens to work in the engineering department, and for years you're both developing .NET applications and you've both created a car class. Now your car class looks dramatically different than his car class. But one day you're asked by management to work together to build a new application that merges both departments. And you realize that you've got a lot of the code already written, but one big problem exists. Since you both have a car class, .NET may not know which car class to use. Each car class has a different properties and methods defined, so using the wrong car class might, blow up the application. So what do? Well, fortunately, as long as you use different namespaces, you're going to be okay. For example, you might have the following namespace: Great Cars. Maybe that's the name of your company. GreatCars.finance, which is your department, .car. And your counterpart's namespace, who happens to work in engineering, is GreatCars.engineering.car. Now, this is what you call a fully qualified namespace or fully qualified type name, because it uses the full name of the car class to differentiate the two classes from each other. You can think of namespaces like full names, at least in American culture, where you have a first name, a middle name, and a last name, okay, your surname. My name, Robert Tabor. Now, it just so happens when I moved from my home near Chicago, Illinois, and I moved down to Dallas, Texas, that there was somebody else in the town I lived in, near Dallas, that had the same name, Robert Tabor. So we had a naming conflict. There were people that would call my house and look for their bowling buddy, Robert Tabor. Well, that was not me. I don't belong to a bowling league. The way to differentiate my name from his name is that I'm pretty sure that nobody has my middle name, which is Robert Theron Tabor, a fairly unique name. So by using the fully qualified name, it would be easy to differentiate me from the other Robert Tabors of the world. So we can apply this to our own application, like from the previous example in lesson number 6, whenever we were creating a car class. So let's just run through a quick example of how we can create our own namespace there. So what I'm going to do is close down the property page here, and then for my lesson I'm going to add a new class. I'm going to call this the car class. You can see by default it creates the definition, but I'm going to wrap that within a namespace block that I'm calling greatcars.finance. And then I'm going to cut my class definition and paste it within my namespace. Now what I want to do is go to my form. I have a button that I've added to my form, and I'm going to play some code to create a new instance of my car class within the button one click event. Now it won't really do anything because you can see the definition for the car class is currently empty, but all I want to do is just make sure that I can actually create a reference to this car, instantiate it. Okay, so I'm going to go dim my car as new car. Okay, notice right away that I get this little type car is not defined. Well, what happened here? Because this seemed to work in the previous lesson where we created a new instance of the car class. Well, the reason is because we don't have a reference to the car class that is in the same namespace that we are currently writing code within. So, to put it another way, we're currently writing code within the public class form1. We know from looking at the project properties for lesson 7 that our default namespace is lesson 07. So the fully qualified type name for our form1 would be lesson07.form1. However, when we created our car class, what would be the fully qualified type name for the car class? It would be lesson07.greatcars.finance.car. Okay, it's just an elongated name, and we'll show why this is important in just a few moments. But what we need to do is refer to the car class like so. In fact, I'm going to redo this line of code just so you can see what's really going on here. Dim lesson 07 dot, dim my car as lesson 07 dot great cars. You can see it shows up now in IntelliSense dot finance dot car equals new lesson 07 dot great cars dot finance dot car. Okay, so now this should work. I don't have any little blue squiggly lines, and it seems to work because I click my button. We don't get any error messages, so that is exactly what we were trying to accomplish. But the downside is that I have this super long series of type names of namespaces that I have to work with now. There's actually a way to get rid of all this and use a shortcut. So I'm going to delete all of this, and actually I'm going to just cut this last part right here and go above my definition for the class form1, and I'm going to use an import statement. So you can see here lesson07.greatcars.finance. And what this will do is allow me to reference all of the classes that are within this namespace without having to use the fully qualified namespace before the type name, in this case car. Okay, so if we were to run this application again, you'll notice that no problems now, no blue squiggly lines. I'm able to import all the classes that belong to that namespace by using an import statement. Now, what I want to do is kind of confuse the issue a little bit here by adding a second namespace. And notice that I'm going to continue to use the car.vb file in order to create a new namespace and a new class. Unlike previous versions of Visual Basic, you can add multiple classes to a single file. So this might be a little bit new for some of you who might have experience with previous versions of Visual Basic, but what I can do in the same file, because there's no relationship between the files and the classes, is create a new namespace called greatcars.engineering. Okay, and inside that I'm going to create public class car. Alright, so now whenever we come back here to our Form 1, which car is this referring to? Well, because of the import statement, we have let the Visual Basic compiler know that we are referring to our first car class, the one that we defined earlier. So what happens then if we were to add a second import statement? Notice immediately whenever I add that line of code, I get a little blue squiggly line under car. And take a look, it says car is ambiguous, imported from the namespaces or types lesson07greatcars.engineering and lesson07@greatcars.finance. So we have confused our application, we've confused Visual Basic because it doesn't know which car class it should create an instance of, the one that belongs to engineering or the one that belongs to finance. So in this particular case, if we have this situation, we might have to use the fully qualified type name instead of just using the truncated type name, relying on the import statement. Okay, don't worry about creating your own namespaces just yet. You don't really need them for your applications at this point since you're just getting started. The only reason that I'm introducing them is to help you see the importance of namespaces within the .NET Framework Class Library, or rather the FCL. Whenever you find a class that you need to use for your application, whether that class is to access a database or open an XML file or just open a file on your hard drive or write a form to the screen, whatever it is, you're going to need to do one of three things in order to access those classes. First, you can use a fully qualified namespace in front of the class name, or secondly, you can create an import statement at the very top of the file for the namespace in question, or thirdly, you can add a reference in the property pages to the namespace that contains the classes you need to use. I'm going to show you how to do all three of these right now. So if we were need to work with security, for example, within our .NET application, we might want to do something like this: import system.security, okay? Or, for example, if we wanted to work with input-output with a disk or something of that nature, we might do something like system.io. And so there's a number of these high-level namespaces that are underneath the system namespace, the main namespace within the .NET Framework Class Library, and we can then reference them and then use the classes that belong to those namespaces after we've used the import statement. It would be the equivalent of doing something like we've done here, where I might have to go system.io, or I'm sorry, dim something, system.io. Directory or something along those lines. Instead of having to type that all out, I can just get rid of this now that I have an import statement, and it would be the exact same thing. Okay, so that's how we and why we use import statements within our applications whenever we're building apps that rely heavily on the .NET framework. class library. Okay, so the question comes up then, why do we have to, or don't we have to, type in the fully qualified namespace for the message box? So for example, we don't have to do something like this. System dot windows dot forms dot messagebox dot show hi. Why don't we have to type all that out? Why can we just remove all of this? System.windows.forms. After all, there's no import statement here at the top of our file. Well, the reason for that is that there are default namespaces that are already imported for you by virtue of the fact that you're creating a Windows Forms application. It's just something that happens whenever you create a new Windows Forms application from the templates, whenever you go to File, New Project, and select a new Windows Forms application. So if you take a look at the property pages for your project and you go to the References tab on the left-hand side, you'll see that there's a number of reference names that are already created for you, and these are the equivalent of using imports system.windows.forms in this particular example. And you could add to this list as opposed to typing in an import statement by clicking the Add button and then selecting from the various available namespaces that are already installed on the system. So we could, for example, import system.security or system.xml or whatever the case might be, and then we wouldn't have to create an import statement each time we wanted to use the classes in one of those respective namespaces. Okay, so the next question is, what classes can we use within our applications? What namespaces can we look to? And what you see on this slide is a number of the most popular namespaces that will allow you to do things. And keep in mind that there's a lot more, and this is just a starting point for you. For example, we've already looked at system.windows.forms. This gives you access to all the form and control related classes. System.data, as we'll see in the next couple of videos, is kind of the behind-the-scenes classes for all things that are related to data access, the data set, and the various other database-related objects. System.net allows us to communicate with the internet. We can actually use system.web in order to create web pages, ASP.NET web pages, and there's a bunch of classes related to that as well. System.io allows you to retrieve and read text from external sources like files or the internet. It includes classes like the stream class and the text reader, and we'll be using some of these in our RSS reader application. The system.xml class, which we're going to look at in a couple of videos, allows us to retrieve and read XML. It has classes like the XML text reader, the XML document, and again, lesson 10, we'll talk about this quite a bit. System.text, it gives us ways to work with strings, like concatenate strings, in a much more effective way than what we could just use with the string class by itself. It gives us a class called String Builder, which optimizes our ability to work with strings. And there's quite a few others. These are just some that I wanted to point out to you. And now the next question you might be asking yourself is, how did you figure all this out? Where did you find all this information? Again, I think I said this earlier in the lesson. It's going to take a lot of time. You're going to have to, watch videos. You're going to have to read articles, read books, go through the help system, which is what I'm going to demonstrate next. But you start learning about the various things that are available to you by practicing, by experimenting, by reading and looking at other code that other people have built, or having a question in your mind, I wonder how I do whatever, and then getting on a search engine and finding a particular reference to that somewhere on the internet. Those are the best ways to learn the language, to really get in, and I mean not the language, but the class library, to find out all the things that are available to you within the FCL. The next thing I want to demonstrate is how to find great information about the various classes that are available within the .NET framework. And the best way to do that is through the use of the help system. We can access the help system by going to the help menu at the very top of the IDE, and you'll notice that there are actually many different ways to interface with the help system. For example, by selecting either How Do I, Search, Contents, or Index, it'll bring open this documentation viewer where we can either view the How Do I articles, search for items within this search tab, limiting them by the various languages or topics that we might be looking for. We can also take a look at the contents by using more of a drill down analogy to find information that we might be interested in. Or we can use the index, which allows us to type a portion of what we're looking for in, and the more that I type, the more narrowly defined it becomes until I find exactly what I'm looking for. Whenever I select one of the items within the index or within the contents pane or whatever the case might be, you can see that there then is available to me a number of topics. By selecting one of the topics, I can then view more information about that particular topic here in the article pane. Now, say, for example, I find something that's particularly interesting in an article that I'm looking at here within the help system. Notice that each of the articles have a URL that looks much like a website URL, except that these are local to your computer. So what I can do is just select everything here by double-clicking on it, and then, let's do this, right-clicking and selecting Copy, and then going back to the IDE and placing a bookmark to it by simply adding a comment, a single tick within my code, and then pasting in the URL. So now if I ever want to get back to this particular article, all I could do is hold down the Control key on my keyboard and then click it, and you'll notice that it opens it up here within the main IDE, so I can be looking at this and working on code at the same time. So notice it's just another tab, and what I can even do is make this a new horizontal tab group, so I can be looking at the help and some of the code examples here on the bottom and using some of those code examples here on the top, and in order to more quickly utilize, in this case, the MessageBox class. Okay, so I'm just going to close this down, but you can see that you have a lot of power at your fingertips. And as you're getting started, there's help literally crawling out of every nook and cranny of Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition to help you, whether it's through IntelliSense or through the Dynamic Help window, or by using the selecting something and using the F1 key on your keyboard in order to look up something. For example, there's lots of different ways to access the help system, and then also get back to various articles by creating bookmarks, I guess you'd say, within your code. And there's other ways to create bookmarks and things of that nature as well within the help system that we're not going to take a look at right now. Okay, so that concludes our look at the help system. In this video we covered quite a bit of ground in regards to the .NET Framework, the Framework Class Library, the .NET Runtime. We didn't talk much about the utilities, but we did talk about namespaces and why they're useful, and we looked at some of the namespaces of the .NET Framework Class Library and how to find out more about the various classes and namespaces that are available by using the help system that we just took a look at. So I hope this video was helpful to you in that regard. Again, this was truly an introductory look at many of these concepts to let you know that they exist and how the .NET Framework and the Framework Class Library impacts your development efforts. As you see, there's a lot more to .NET than first meets the eye, and you don't need to know it all, and you don't need to know all the internals of how the .NET Framework actually works in order to be productive, but it helps whenever you're developing or debugging your applications to know the why behind the how. So if you enjoyed this video, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one, aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic.net, ASP.NET, and more. Thank you.